For more on the industry changes for the airline industry, I'm joined by Seth Kaplan. Again, he's the managing partner of Airline Wiki. Seth, good to see you. We talked about this last time. Why don't airlines simply just avoid these areas? It seemed to be very logical. There wasn't a huge oil impact. They would just simply have to go around. Is that crazy?
Yeah, Phil, there are, quite frankly, simply just a lot of areas that if you try to eliminate any risk at all that you have to avoid. So, very much a judgment call here. But in fact, airlines have in fact been saying, we want more guidance. We want, instead of sort of these advisories that, you might want to think twice about flying all of these places, tell us really what to avoid, especially after what did happen in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think here's what's shocking is that, first of all, this hasn't happened, at least in recent memory. And now that it has happened, that changes the entire risk dynamic of actually flying. If you have two flights, one flies over Ukraine and one doesn't fly to Ukraine, it's pretty obvious that I would pick the one that doesn't fly over Ukraine, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to be, there's not a dilemma here.
And in retrospect, obviously, it was a poor decision to fly over Ukraine. But, there are all kinds of other risks, weather risks, as we've also learned all too well in recent weeks. So, when you're a pilot working with your airline, working with air traffic control, trying to determine if the weather is more of a risk than something else, fortunately, more often than not, the decisions are good ones. But we've seen in recent weeks, not just the decision to fly over Ukraine, but perhaps the decision to land in Taiwan, although we'll learn more about that. For example, these are tough choices and usually the correct ones made, but not always.
Seth, I want to ask you, Malaysian Airlines, we mentioned it earlier, they're now thinking about changing their names. We don't know what happened to the first flight, Flight 370. We do know what happened to the second flight, number 17. Where does the company do from here? I mean, I know people are blaming them, but some people are also coming to their defense saying that, hey, look, we don't know what happened to one of the flights, and the other one wasn't their fault.
Yeah, no question that there was at least some very bad luck involved. What happened over Ukraine, yes, they did choose to fly there, but so did many other airlines, even though some others were avoiding it. Clearly, at this point, they're unsustainable by themselves. So it's going to take a lot of government support to keep them going. There is precedent in the world for turning around an airline like that, but not a ton of precedent. And as you said, perhaps rebranding. There's been talk of perhaps merging with an airline called AirAsia X, a long-haul arm of a rather successful low-cost carrier, AirAsia, also based in Malaysia. So lots of scenarios, but they do need something. They can't just keep going on their current trajectory. That's rather clear.
We had a spate last week where I think 3 or 4 days we had 3 or 4 accidents. 2 were weather-related, as you mentioned. And look, I like flying, but there are a lot of folks who are kind of on the fence about flying. They're already nervous when everything is fine. What do you tell those folks to say that, hey, look, this all makes me too nervous about flying? How do you calm them down?
Well, flying still is safer than almost any other thing we do during our lives, and there have been times when I've taken a trip, let's say, perhaps to a zone of the world that was, where there had been some conflict. And people in my own life say, are you nervous? And I say, well, nervous about what? The drive to the airport? Because that's more dangerous than the flight all the way to, let's say a place like Libya, which I did visit last year. I perhaps would not do that at the moment, for example. So certainly lots of risk in our lives, risk when we fly, but less risk in terms of the flight itself than a lot of other things that we do.
Since we have you, what's the latest now with the investigation of Flight 17 on the ground there in that disputed area in eastern Ukraine? Malaysian Airlines has said that they're trying to get their people on the ground. They had an agreement apparently with the separatists, but then the Ukrainian military is supposed to come in as well. It's gotten quite messy. I don't know if we're ever going to have a real investigation.
I don't know either, Phil. I mean, the fortunate thing here, if you can say anything's fortunate about an absolutely awful situation, is that we already know so much more about what happened there than we knew, for example, about 370. Again, just the fact that we are dealing with the debris field, that we know where it is. It's on land, not in the water, and so forth. So, many of the questions are really more geopolitical questions, questions about who fired the missile, for example, not necessarily questions that would be answered by anything on the ground there. But no question, Phil, this is far from an ideal situation for investigators.
Very quickly, have you heard anything about that first aircraft that has gone, I guess missing is the correct word, but 370?
Phil, we are really just about as far away as ever from finding it. As you know, as the weeks went on, certainly certain indications that helped narrow down the field, but still narrowing it only to a degree that, unprecedented, being able to find an aircraft in those circumstances. We talked, you might remember back then, about the fact that, you had situations that were so much more was known, and yet it took years to find, for example, that Air France aircraft off the coast of Brazil. In that situation, 2 years to find an aircraft where basically everybody knew more or less where it went down. So, here you're still talking about perhaps not being able to narrow it down within hundreds of miles. Rather daunting.
It's really amazing with all the technology that we have today. Seth Kaplan, it's good to see you from Fort Lauderdale. Thank you very much.